Verity Tate traded her wedding ring for bread on the 3rd day of February, in the coldest week of the coldest winter Ashmore Gulch had known in 20 years, and she did it standing up straight with her chin level and her voice steady, because she had learned by then that the only thing a woman in her position could keep was her dignity. And she meant to keep it even while she sold the last thing she owned that mattered. She was 24 years old. Her husband had been dead 11 months. Daniel Tate, killed in the collapse of the Ashmore Tunnel along with 9 other men, buried under a mountain he had been paid $2 a day to dig into, and the mining company had sent his widow a letter of regret and $18 and no more, having determined by its own internal inquiry that the collapse was an act of God and not of shoddy. Timbering, which was a convenient conclusion for a company that had cut its timber budget the previous autumn. Verity had not had the money to fight it. She had a 5-year-old daughter, Pippa, and a bedridden mother-in-law, Ivy, who had come to live with them the year before her son died, and who could not now be moved nor left alone, and a rented 2-room house with the rent falling due, and $18 and a wedding ring. The $18 had gone by June. After that it had been the furniture, piece by piece, Daniel's good chair, the walnut table that had been a wedding present, the bedstead, so that they slept now on ticks on the floor, and then it had been the sewing she took in and the washing she took in, and the long walk out to the Hendricks place 3 days a week to scrub floors for $1.50. And still it was not enough. Because a bedridden old woman needs medicine, and a growing child needs shoes, and a landlord needs his rent, and coal costs what coal costs in February. Verity had gone without her own supper more nights that winter than she could count, and had learned the particular light-headed clarity of a woman feeding 2 other people out of a portion meant for one. And on the 2nd day of February the flour crock came up empty, and the coal bin with it, and she went through the house looking for anything else she could sell, and found that there was nothing left at all. Except the ring. It was not a valuable ring, or she had never thought so. A slim band of worked silver, twisted like a rope, with a small bright river garnet set flush in it, the whole thing bought second-hand in a shop in Denver by a young miner with 3 weeks' wages in his pocket and no notion how to buy a ring, who had chosen it, he told her later, because the little red stone made him think of her. It was the only thing Daniel Tate ever gave her that had cost him anything. She had worn it 6 years. She had worn it while she buried him. And on the 3rd day of February, with her daughter's stomach growling in the next room, and her mother-in-law coughing the dry cough that meant the cold was getting into her chest, Verity Tate worked the ring off her finger. It came hard, for though she had grown so thin that winter it should have slid, her knuckle had swollen with the cold and the scrubbing, and put on her thin coat and walked down through the snow to the mercantile of Ambrose Slade. Slade dealt in everything and lent on anything, which in a poor town in a bad winter was a profitable arrangement. And he had grown fat on the desperation of his neighbors and had come to enjoy it, in the small mean way of small mean men. He turned the ring over under his lamp with his thick fingers and his mouth pulled down, and named a figure so insulting that Verity's face went hot. "That is a fraction of what it's worth," she said. "It's good silver, and the stone's a true garnet. You know it as well as I do, Misty Slade, what a thing is worth," said Ambrose Slade comfortably, "and what I'll give are 2 different numbers, Mrs. Tate, and the difference between them is what I like to call the cost of being in a hurry. And you are in a hurry, aren't you? Your girl's not eaten today, I'd wager. The old woman's coughing. Coal's dear. So you can walk that ring down to Coleman's and see what he offers you, only Coleman's is 9 miles off and it's 12 degrees and your girl is still hungry when you get back. He smiled and pushed the coins across the counter, a small, mean little stack. "Or you can take that and buy flour and coal today. It's all one to me." And Verity Tate stood in that warm shop with her ring in a fat man's hand and understood exactly what was being done to her, and understood equally that she was going to let it be done. Because the arithmetic of hunger admits of no pride, and Pippa had eaten nothing since a bowl of thin soup the night before. So she said, quietly, "I'll take it. But I'd like a ticket on it, please, a proper pledge ticket with the term written out so I can redeem it when I've the money." And Slade laughed at her, laughed out loud, at the notion of a widow scrubbing floors for $1.50 redeeming anything, ever, but he wrote the ticket, 30 days because the law required it, and because it cost him nothing. And Verity folded it into her bodice as though it were the deed to a kingdom, and took the coins, and bought flour and beans and a little bacon and a half-hundredweight of coal, and carried the whole of it home up the hill through the snow, and fed her daughter and her mother-in-law that night, and did not weep until both of them were asleep. She kept the pledge ticket. That was the thing. She kept it and looked at it some nights the way other people look at a photograph, and she did the sums over and over in her head. So much for rent, so much for medicine, so much for coal, and if she took the weaver washing as well, and if she gave up her own supper 4 nights instead of 3, then in 30 days she might just have, the redemption price. It was not sensible. She knew it was not sensible. A ring is a thing, and food is a need, and any practical woman would have let it go and been glad of the flour. But Verity Tate had lost her husband, and her furniture, and her bed, and her health, and every scrap of her small, comfortable life, one piece at a time across 11 months, and the ring had been the last piece. And something in her had set itself with a kind of desperate stubbornness on the idea that she would win back this one thing, this single small thing, or the losing would never stop. She did not know that a man had been standing at the back of Ambrose Slade's shop that afternoon, half hidden behind a rack of harness, waiting to settle an account, and that he had heard every word of the whole of it. His name was Gabriel Thorne, and he was, though few in Ashmore Gulch would have guessed it to look at him, one of the wealthiest men in that part of the territory. He owned timber and an interest in 2 good mines that were not the Ashmore, and 11,000 acres up on Cathedral Ridge where he ran cattle and kept to himself in a big log house he had built with his own hands, and he came down to town perhaps once a month in an old canvas coat with his beard untrimmed, and let people take him for a hired hand, and rather enjoyed it. He was 39, a big, slow-moving, quiet man with black hair going iron at the temples and steady dark eyes, and he had heard every word Ambrose Slade said to that thin widow, and felt the old familiar anger rise in him at the sound of a comfortable man squeezing a desperate one. And then Slade had set the ring down on the counter under the lamp, and Gabriel Thorne had gone absolutely still. Because he knew that ring. He had made it. 22 years before, Gabriel Thorne had been a boy of 17 apprenticed to a silversmith in Denver, poor as dirt and clumsy at the trade, and mostly employed in sweeping the shop and heating the crucible. And on his own time, out of a bit of scrap silver his master let him keep, he had made a ring. The first thing he ever made all the way through by himself, a slim band twisted like rope, set with a small river garnet he had bought for 40 cents from a prospector. He had made it for a girl. He had been 17 and in love, and the girl was called Hetty and had red hair, and he had worked on that ring 6 weeks by candlelight after the shop closed, and had got it finished at last and beautiful, and had carried it in his pocket 4 days working up the nerve, and had come round to her house on the 5th day to find her gone east with her family, without a word, gone for good. He had not thrown the ring away. He kept it a year, and then, needing money badly, and wanting the reminder gone, he sold it into the shop's stock for what the silver weighed, and left the silversmith's trade not long after, and went up into the mountains, and made his fortune slow and hard over 20 years in timber and cattle and ore. And he had never in all that time seen the ring again, and had thought of it perhaps twice a year, and had never once expected to walk into a mercantile in Ashmore Gulch at 39 years old and find the first thing he ever made lying on a counter under a lamp, being taken off a starving woman for a quarter of its worth. He waited until she had gone. Then he crossed to the counter and said, "That ring." "Just came in," said Slade, brightening at the prospect of a quick turn. "Nice little piece. Silver's good, stone's a true garnet, $50, said Gabriel Thorne. Ambrose Slade's mouth opened and shut. $50 was 8 times what he had paid and 4 times what the ring was honestly worth, and every instinct in him said take it. And every other instinct said there was something here he did not understand and might profit by. He hesitated a fraction too long, and Gabriel Thorne, who had spent 20 years buying timber tracts from men who hesitated, said $50, and I'll tell you why, so you don't strain yourself scheming. That ring's pledged, 30 days, you wrote her the ticket yourself, which means for 30 days it isn't yours to sell to me nor anybody, and if you sell it out from under that pledge, I'll have the law and the newspaper over in Bannock Springs both, and I'll buy the paper if I have to, and you'll be finished in this town inside a month. So here's the arrangement. I'm buying the pledge, not the ring. $50 now, and the ring goes into my keeping and not yours, and the pledge stands. If that woman comes in with the redemption money any day inside the 30, she gets her ring back for what she owes and not a penny more, and you send word up to me on the ridge that same hour. And if you cheat her, Slade, in any particular, I'll know it, and I'll come back down. He paid the $50, and he walked out of that shop with a ring in his pocket that he had made when he was 17 years old, and stood a long moment in the frozen blue street of Ashmore Gulch looking up the hill after a woman he did not know, and he thought about a young miner buying a second-hand ring with 3 weeks' wages because a red stone made him think of a girl, and about that girl grown into a widow trading it for flour with her chin up, and Gabriel Thorne found that his eyes were stinging, which had not happened to him in a good long while. He did not go up the hill after her that day. He was not, whatever else he was, a man who went crashing into a woman's life with a ring and a fortune and expected gratitude. He had a horror of that sort of thing. The rich man's charity that costs him nothing and costs the taker everything. But he made inquiries, quietly, over the following weeks. He learned about Daniel Tate and the tunnel and the $18. He learned about Ivy Tate, bedridden these 2 years with the wasting stiffness in her joints, and about the little girl Pippa, and about the sold furniture and the 3 days a week scrubbing at the Hendricks place and the washing taken in, and the fact, which he had from the Hendricks cook, and which lodged in him like a splinter, that Mrs. Tate ate almost nothing at all, and had been seen more than once to slip her own dinner into her pocket for the child. He learned that she had never once asked the town for charity, nor the church, nor complained in anyone's hearing, and that she was, by every account, proud as a cat and twice as stubborn, and that anyone who offered her money outright would get it handed straight back. So Gabriel Thorne, who had made a considerable fortune by being patient and indirect, set about the business of helping a woman who would not be helped. It began with work. He He let it be known through the Hendricks cook, a laundress and mender up at Cathedral Ridge, the ranch having 11 hands and no woman to see to their washing, and he was prepared to pay well above the going rate because the ridge was far off and the work was heavy. It was a real position and a real need. He had been meaning to hire someone for 2 years, and when Verity Tate applied for it, he interviewed her gravely and hired her on the spot at a wage that was generous but not so generous as to be suspicious, and arranged that a wagon would fetch the washing down and back, so she need not leave her mother-in-law. It doubled her income at a stroke. She had no idea it had been created for her. It went on from there, in small, invisible ways. The coal merchant, who owed Gabriel Thorne money, discovered a clerical error in Mrs. Tate's favor and a standing discount he could not quite account for. The doctor in Ashmore Gulch, who had been on the point of ceasing his calls on old Ivy Tate, the family clearly being unable to pay, found himself quietly retained by an anonymous party to continue the visits, along with the medicine. A crate of good coal oil and a side of bacon appeared in the church poor cupboard with instructions that it go to the Tate house and nowhere else, and the parson, who was in on it and thought it the most enjoyable thing that had happened to him in years, delivered it with a straight face and a story about a surplus from the harvest supper that would not have withstood 5 seconds examination. And Gabriel Thorne, who had every reason to stay up on his ridge, began finding reasons to be in town on the days the washing wagon came down. They talked, at first, about laundry and weather, and then about her mother-in-law's cough, and then, slowly, across the weeks of that late winter, about everything else. He found her sharp and dryly funny in a way that surprised him, and possessed of a fierce, clear-eyed intelligence that had had nowhere to go for 11 months but into the arithmetic of survival. She found him unlike any man she had met, a big, quiet fellow in a shabby coat who listened more than he talked, who never once looked at her with pity, who asked her opinion about the cattle market and appeared to actually want the answer, and who had a way of being present without pressing that she found, after a year of being either invisible or preyed upon, extraordinarily restful. She took him for a foreman or a senior hand up at the Thorne place. He did not correct her. He told himself it was because the correction would change how she spoke to him, which was true, and he told himself it was not cowardice, which was less true. And on the 29th day, she walked into Ambrose Slade's mercantile with the money. She had done it. She had taken the Cathedral Ridge washing and the Weaver washing both, and given up her own supper 5 nights a week instead of 4, and walked out to the Hendricks place in weather that would have kept a mule indoors. And she had the redemption price counted out in coins and small bills in a knotted handkerchief, and she laid it on the counter with her hand shaking, not from fear, from exhaustion, and said, "The ring, please, Mr. Slade. I've the ticket here, and the money's all there. You may count it." And here Ambrose Slade made the last mistake of his career in Ashmore Gulch, because it galled him, it genuinely galled him, that this woman had done the impossible thing he had laughed at her for, and because the $50 in his pocket had turned in 4 weeks from a windfall into a grievance, the ring plainly being worth more than he had understood, and because small mean men cannot bear to be beaten by people they have decided are beneath them. He looked at the money, and he looked at her, and he said, with an ugly little shrug, "Sold." The shop went very quiet. It was pledged, Verity said. 30 days. You wrote the ticket. Man came in and made an offer I couldn't refuse, and the ring's gone up the mountain, said Slade. That's business. I'll give you your ticket money back, and there's an end of it. He was already reaching for the coins. You'd have done better to spend it on the child, like I said at thee. He did not finish the sentence, because the door had opened and shut, and a big man in a shabby canvas coat was standing in the shop. "I told you," said Gabriel Thorne. "What would happen if you cheated her?" Verity turned, bewildered, to see the quiet foreman from Cathedral Ridge crossing the floor with a face she had never seen on him, not angry, exactly, but hard and absolutely settled, the face of a man arriving at a place he had been walking toward for a while. Slade had gone the color of paper. "Mr. Thorne, sir, I never—" "It was in your keeping, I only meant. You meant to keep her money and her ring both, and tell her a lie about it, and send her home to her hungry girl." Gabriel Thorne reached across the counter, took up the knotted handkerchief of coins, and put it back into Verity's hands, closing her fingers around it. Then he reached into his coat pocket and brought out the ring, and Ambrose Slade made a small noise. "Mrs. Tate, this is yours. It has been in my pocket since the day you pledged it, which I'll explain in a minute, and you may be as angry about as you like. He never had it to sell. He was never going to have it. And you don't owe him a penny, nor me either, and if he opens his mouth again in this town about you or your husband or your girl, he'll learn what it costs to do business in a county where I own the timber." He turned. "Slade, that account you've been carrying with my mill, it's called in today, and I'd start thinking about somewhere else to live, because by evening this whole town will know what you tried to do to a widow holding a pledge ticket, and there's not a soul in Ashmore Gulch who will set foot in this shop after that. You've made your living off desperate people. Let's see how you get on with none." And then he took Verity Tate's hand, there in the shop, and put her wedding ring back on her finger himself, and it went on her knuckle had gone down again in the warmer weather, or perhaps she had simply stopped being quite so cold, and she stood looking at the small, twisted silver band with its little red stone on her own hand for the first time in 29 days, and could not say a single word. She said a great many words about half an hour later, outside in the snow, once she had got the whole story out of him, who he was and what he owned, and that the Cathedral Ridge laundress position had been invented for her, and the coal discount arranged and the doctor retained, and the parson's harvest surplus a barefaced lie. Verity Tate went white, and then red, and she was angrier than she had been in 11 months of grief and hunger, and it all came out of her at once, standing in the frozen street, that she had thought she was earning her way and had been proud of it, prouder of those 30 days than of anything in her life, and that he had taken even that from her, that she was not a charity case nor a project for a rich man's idle conscience, that she had scrubbed floors and gone without supper and walked 9 miles in the snow for that ring, and he had let her do it while it sat in his pocket the whole time. And Gabriel Thorne stood and took every word of it without flinching, and when she had run out of breath he said, quietly, "Every bit of that's fair. And I'd not argue a word of it but one. I let you do it because you were going to do it whether I helped or no, and because stopping you would have been the cruelest thing I could do." He turned his hat in his hands. "Mrs. Tate, I've been rich 12 years, and I've learned one thing about it that nobody tells you. A rich man can buy a poor woman a ring in about 4 seconds, and in the buying he can take from her the one thing she has left, which is the knowledge that she can do hard things. You'd lost your husband and your furniture and your bed and near everything else. That ring was the one thing in the world you'd set yourself to win back with your own 2 hands. If I'd walked up your hill in February and handed it to you, you'd have had the ring. And I'd have taken the 30 days, and the 30 days were worth more than the ring. So I bought the pledge to keep that snake from selling it out from under you, and then I got out of your way and let you do the thing you'd set out to do. And you did it. You did it, ma'am. In 29 days with 2 people to feed and a wage that wouldn't keep a bird. Nobody gave you that. You went and got it. Verity opened her mouth and shut it again. As for the work, Gabriel went on, the Ridge has wanted a laundress 2 years and now it's got the best one in the county, and I'm paying a fair wage for heavy work and getting the better end of the bargain, which anybody may check. The coal and the doctor I'd apologize for, except that I won't. Because your mother-in-law would be in the ground by now, and I'd sooner have you angry at me than have that. And the parson's harvest surplus was his own idea, and he is insufferably pleased with himself about it. A ghost of a smile. But I'll not do a thing behind your back again from this day. That's a promise. From here on you'll know everything, and you can throw any of it back at me you like, and I'll take it. And Verity Tate, standing in the snow with her ring on her finger, and her 30 days' wages still knotted in her handkerchief, felt her anger going out of her like a tide. Because she had never in her life been given an accounting like that by anybody, let alone an apology, and because he had understood the exact thing about those 30 days that she had not been able to explain even to herself. "Why?" she said at last. "Why any of it? You didn't know me from Eve." So he told her about the ring, about a boy of 17 in a Denver silversmith shop and 6 weeks of candlelight, and a red-haired girl who went east without a word, and a bit of scrap silver twisted like rope with a 40-cent garnet set in it, the first thing he ever made with his own hands. And about standing behind a harness rack 22 years later and watching it come out of a starving woman's fist onto Ambrose Slade's counter. "I made that ring for somebody who never got it," Gabriel Thorne said. And it went off into the world and got itself bought by a young fellow who spent 3 weeks' wages on it because the stone made him think of his girl. And that girl wore it 6 years and buried him in it, and then sold it to feed his mother and his daughter, and never once asked a soul for help. He looked at the small bright thing on her hand. "I've built 100 things since, ma'am, mills and houses and a whole ranch. That ring is the only thing I ever made that mattered, and it turns out it mattered because of what you did with it. So, no. I didn't know you from Eve, but I knew that ring, and I'd have crawled over that mountain to get it back on your hand, and I'd like the chance to know the rest. The rest took the spring and most of the summer, and it went slowly because Verity Tate was not a woman who was ever going to be swept anywhere by anybody again, and because Gabriel Thorne had waited 22 years already and was in no particular hurry. He courted her openly and awkwardly and with a scrupulous honesty about everything, which she came to understand was simply how he was made and not an effort he was putting on. She kept the laundry position and would not give it up, and made him show her the books to prove the wage was fair, which he did laughing, old Ivy Tate, who improved considerably once there was coal and a doctor and food, developed a violent partisanship for the big quiet man and made her opinions known daily from her bed with the frankness of the very ill and the very old. And little Pippa, 5 years old and starved of a father's attention for a year of her short life, simply appropriated him, took his hand in the street, demanded to be carried, fell asleep against his shoulder at the church supper, and was carried home like that through the snow, Gabriel walking as carefully as a man carrying nitroglycerin and looking so quietly undone by it that Verity had to turn her face away. They married in September up at Cathedral Ridge, with the aspens gone gold the whole length of the valley. Ivy Tate was carried up in a sprung wagon and installed in a chair on the porch of the big log house like a queen at a coronation, and lived another 4 years there in the warmth which nobody had expected. Pippa carried the flowers and dropped most of them, Ambrose Slade was not present, having sold his shop in June and moved on to a town where the story had not arrived yet, though stories generally do. And when Verity Tate came up the aisle to Gabriel Thorne, she wore on her right hand a plain new gold band he had made for her himself. He had gone back to the trade for 6 weeks, at 39, and proved much better at it than he had been at 17, and on her left, where it had always been the slim, twisted silver ring with the little river garnet, because she would not be married in anything else, and because Gabriel would never have asked her to be. They had a long life on that ridge. There were more children in time, and Pippa grew up with a father who had chosen her, and the Ashmore Gulch Mining Company found itself facing a wrongful death suit funded by a very wealthy and very patient man, which it settled 4 years on for a sum that went to the widows of all 10 men and not only one. Verity never did become a woman who could sit still and be waited upon, and Gabriel never once suggested it. She ran the household, and then the accounts, and then by degrees a good deal of the business, and she was the only person on earth who could tell Gabriel Thorne he was wrong and be listened to the first time. She wore that ring until the day she died at 81. And it went then to Pippa, and after Pippa to her daughter, and it is somewhere still, most likely, on some hand in some town, a slim band of worked silver twisted like a rope with a small red stone set flush in it. The first thing a poor boy ever made, sold for the weight of its silver bought by a young miner for 3 weeks' wages, traded for flour and beans and a half-hundredweight of coal on the coldest day of a cruel winter, and bought back and set on its rightful hand by the man who had made it 22 years before, and who had never once, in all that time, understood what he was making it for. For that is the thing about the small objects we let go of when we have nothing left. They are never really the thing. The ring was 6 years of a good marriage, and a young man's 3 weeks of wages, and the last remnant of a whole life, and 30 days of a proud woman scrubbing floors in the snow to prove to herself that the losing could be stopped. Ambrose Slade looked at it and saw silver at 1/4 of its worth. Gabriel Thorne looked at it and saw a woman worth crossing a mountain for. And Verity Tate, who traded her wedding ring for bread and was never once ashamed of it, who would have traded 1,000 rings to feed that child and never blinked, learned in the end the only lesson that mattered, that what a person is worth has nothing whatever to do with what they have been forced to sell, and that the right man, when at last he comes, does not simply buy back the things you lost. He hands you the tools and stands out of your light and lets you win them back with your own 2 hands, and then he puts the ring on your finger and calls the victory yours, because it was.